The first flurries had started in the early afternoon, swirling lazily outside the farmhouse window as Amy stood at the sink, rinsing a stack of dishes. She had been listening to the weather forecast all morning, and the meteorologists had been adamant. This storm was going to be a big one. A deep Arctic front was barreling down from Canada, set to collide with a moisture-heavy system from the south. The result? A blizzard warning for all of northern Indiana. Her husband, Tom, had spent most of the day making sure they were prepared. He had checked the generator just in case and filled the bathtubs with water. They had plenty of canned goods and firewood stacked high in the living room near the fireplace. Their 3 children, Mason, Ellie, and Will, were thrilled at the prospect of snow, but Amy had a bad feeling about this one. By dinner time, the storm had arrived in full force. The wind howled outside, rattling the old farmhouse windows and whistling through the gaps in the door frames. Snow came down in thick, heavy sheets, quickly blanketing the landscape. Mason, the oldest at 10, pressed his face against the frosty window pane, eyes wide. "Whoa," he breathed. "It's like the end of the world out there." Tom chuckled as he ladled chili into bowls. "Not quite, bud, but we'll be staying inside for a while. Let's just hope we don't lose power." They had barely sat down to eat when the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. Ellie, the 7-year-old, let out a squeak of alarm. "Daddy." Tom sighed and pushed back from the table. "I'll check the breaker, but I think the whole area is out." Amy reached for the flashlight she had placed on the counter earlier, flipping it on. "We'll be fine, sweetheart," she reassured Ellie, but even she felt a tight knot of unease forming in her stomach. A few minutes later, Tom returned from the mudroom, brushing snow off his coat. "It's not just us," he confirmed. "The whole street is dark." The fireplace at least was roaring, providing some heat and light, but without power, there was no glowing streetlights outside, no hum of the refrigerator, no whir of the furnace. The house was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak as the wind pushed against the walls. Then an explosion shattered the silence. A bright blue flash illuminated the storm outside, and a loud boom followed. Will, the youngest at 5, screamed, and Ellie clung to Amy's side. Even Mason, who prided himself on being tough, looked unnerved. "That was the transformer," Tom muttered. He went back to the window and squinted through the snow. "Yep, it blew, which means the phone lines are probably down too." Amy bit her lip. No power was one thing, but no phone meant they were completely cut off. She reached for her cell phone, but as she feared, there was no service. "Okay," she said, putting on her best calm mom voice. "We're prepared for this. We'll stay by the fire tonight, and tomorrow we'll see what we can do." The night stretched on endlessly. The wind howled, rattling the house with a fury that made it feel like the roof might peel away at any moment. The kids, bundled in layers of blankets, tossed and turned, complaining of the cold despite the fire. Without the background hum of electricity, every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, keeping Amy awake long after everyone else had drifted into uneasy sleep. By dawn, the storm had finally relented, leaving behind a world that looked like something out of a snow globe. Thick drifts covered everything, and the snowplow hadn't yet made it down their rural road. Tom was the first to step outside, and Amy followed, squinting against the blinding brightness of the morning sun reflecting off the untouched snow. Their mailbox had all but disappeared. The driveway was completely buried, and the snow had drifted so high against the barn that only the peak of the roof was visible. "Looks like we're going to be digging out for a while," Tom said grimly. As the morning went on, the neighborhood slowly came to life. Despite the freezing temperatures, people emerged from their homes bundled in heavy coats, scarves, and gloves. Snow shovels scraped against driveways, voices called back and forth as neighbors checked in on each other. Amy waved to the Johnsons across the street, who were digging out their front porch, and the elderly Carter couple next door, who looked overwhelmed by the sheer amount of snow that had piled up overnight. Tom gestured toward them. "I'll go help." Amy nodded and turned back to the house. Inside, the kids were restless. Mason had tried to read by flashlight, Ellie had attempted to play with her dolls, and Will had spent the morning whining about being cold and hungry. "Enough," Amy said, clapping her hands. "Get your coats on. We're going outside." Their protest quickly faded once they saw the mounds of snow. Mason immediately grabbed a shovel and started helping his dad. Ellie and Will, on the other hand, dove right in, making tunnels and forts. The cold air was sharp, but the movement kept them warm, and soon their cheeks were pink from exertion. As Amy shoveled, she kept an eye on the road. A few streets over, the power company had arrived. Their bright orange trucks and workers in neon vests stood out against the stark white snow as they worked on repairing the downed lines. Farther down, another crew from the phone company was attempting to get service restored. It would take hours, maybe even days to get everything back up and running. But there was something oddly reassuring about seeing the entire neighborhood come together like this. By the time the sun began to set, progress had been made. Their driveway was clear enough to reach the road, and the neighbors had helped dig out the Carter's walkway. The power and phone crews were still at it, their floodlights cutting through the early twilight. That night, the house was still without power, but the atmosphere was different. The kids, exhausted from playing in the snow, huddled close under the blankets near the fire. Tom sat beside Amy, rubbing warmth back into his hands. "This reminds me of when I was a kid," he said with a chuckle. "No screens, no distractions, just people talking and working together." Amy smiled, pulling the blankets tighter around Will, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder. "I guess it's a good reminder that we can manage without modern conveniences, at least for a little while." The next morning, the house hummed back to life. The power flickered on at dawn, followed by the familiar chime of the landline. A collective cheer rose from the neighborhood as people stepped outside to celebrate their restored electricity. Amy turned on the radio, just to hear something other than silence. The announcer was talking about the storm's impact. Over 1.5 feet of snow, thousands of outages across the state, and emergency crews still working to clear major highways. It had been a long, difficult 2 days, but as Amy looked around at her family, at Mason grinning as he charged his tablet, at Ellie happily brushing her doll's hair, and Will sleepily rubbing his eyes, she felt something unexpected: gratitude. Because while the storm had left them cold, tired, and disconnected from the world, it had also reminded them of something important: the power of resilience, the strength of community, and the simple joy of being together. Thanks for tuning in to Fireside Stories. Remember before you leave to like and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time that we're all gathered around the fire.